Okay, so we are in Ephesians chapter 5 today, and last time we went through Ephesians 4. Does anybody remember any highlight from Ephesians 4? Maybe you want to mention the last verse, like verse 32, 4:32. Be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. Do. Ephesians 4:32. That's right there.
I don't remember that one.
Oh, well.
Did you sing it last week?
Yep. So it's right here, 4:32. So this, if you were going to choose a verse, I think, to describe what we talked about last week in all of chapter 4, it's really talking about being kind to and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ and God forgave you. So Paul is really into that grace and mercy stuff, right? And he's describing to them how they need to then put on that mind that was of Christ. Put on that forgiving, merciful, allow one another to have grace. So Greg, I offer Greg grace because Christ offered me grace. And Greg offers me grace because Christ offered him grace. It's not dependent on how Greg treats me. It's dependent on the fact that God treated me a certain way. And so that governs my response. And so Greg and I, in our relationship with one another, in our friendship, then we react because of what Christ did for us, not because what Greg did for me. It changes things, huh? That's different than the world. In the world, we're nice to the people who are nice to us. And if someone's mean to us, that gives us permission to be mean to them. I would think that a lot of people in the world would even consider that pretty generous. That if someone is nice to you, be nice to them. If they're not nice to you, you'll just ignore them. That would be the friendly way to do it. But we're called to something else, something higher, a higher calling, which says that I'm going to be what I'm going to be because of what God has been. There was a really good posting on the internet. I forget who put it up, and I shared it, but it said something like, I'm not nice to you because you're nice. I'm nice to you because I am nice, or something like that. I'm not polite to you because you're polite to me. I'm polite to you because I am polite. I'm not going to treat you with grace because you're being that way to me. I'm going to treat you with grace because I've been given grace. It's that focus on that's who we are in this world, because we are focused on God and what he's done for us, not on what everyone else does for us. That changes the way we look at things. So it's pretty hard to feel sorry for yourself, isn't it? That's the bad part. When you want to feel sorry for yourself and have a good poor me party, it's pretty hard, because when you have a poor me party, it's always good to have someone to blame on your terrible condition that you have to suffer with, right? It's very convenient to do that. So it kind of changes your thinking in that way. Okay, so let's take a look at Ephesians chapter 5. Now here's the first verse, gives you the heading of what he's going to talk about. 5:1. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Now, that's the intro. So what do you think the rest is going to be about? It's going to be about, what does that look like? Because Julia might think that behaving a certain way is being very good. And I may say, no, that's not so good, right? We might have a difference of opinion about what is right. So what Paul's having to do, especially when he's working with a group like the Ephesians, because remember the Ephesians had a lot of different religions and stuff in that area. It was a real popular area where people came through all the time. So you saw a lot of different religions going on. So Paul isn't saying here, you are allowed to be a Mormon and you're not allowed to be a Catholic. You're allowed to be a Jehovah's Witness, but you're not allowed to be a Seventh-day Adventist. That's not what he's saying. He's not going through and listing all the religions and saying, now you can be this, but not that, this, not that. We think that way. What Paul's saying is you need to be what? What does he say in that verse we just read? The very first words, be
imitators of God.
Now, wait a minute. It'd be one thing to be an imitator of Christ, but I even got to be one of God? Come on. What did God do that we are supposed to be imitating?
He doesn't look at anybody as an individual without looking at everybody evenly. He don't. you don't have anybody's corns that, whatever I'm trying to say.
Yes.
I know what I'm trying to say, but I ain't
Yes, I think I understand what he's saying. He doesn't have a preference for people. He doesn't say, oh, well, I love orange dresses, so Laura's in today, right? He's fair and he's a judge. He's a judge, but he's also allows us a way to approach him. He provided a way to approach him. So who loves more, Christ or God?
They're the same.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes is the answer, right? Yes. Christ is God. God is Christ. Isn't that interesting that Paul starts with God, though? Because we usually think of be loving like Christ was loving. Isn't it interesting that here he starts with God? Be an imitator of God. Therefore, as dearly loved children. Why is that important? Be an imitator of God as dearly loved children.
We got to remember we do as his children.
Our position is kind of a position. You're in the family, but you've been applied grace. Now, if you were from a family that didn't have very loving or caring relationships, would this passage be a problem for you? Potentially, right? Because God the Father is not necessarily like the Father that some of our people have, some people we know have had to deal with, right? So there is that problem there. But Paul is saying, be imitators of God as dearly loved children. In other words, not as children that have been punished or picked on or whatever else that could be a father's role, right? God the Father is keeping you as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loves us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But among you, there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality. Okay, so the overall thing is imitators of God as dearly loved children. So Paul says, okay, now because that banner is going across the top, the next thing he says is, so that means you should not have sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. So it's not like anything goes, right? There are standards of behavior that are pleasing to God, and we need to consider that. Now, wouldn't anybody know this already? Doesn't everybody know that sexual immorality is not godly? Well, we have more of, especially in the U.S., there's a general knowledge of what Christians do or don't do. Sometimes people have a correct view and sometimes they don't. If you get into circles where there aren't very many Christian people, you can get some pretty odd belief systems going on, right? So here, in this case, he's saying something that's for the whole world forever, not just for now, not just for us right here. So maybe we have, and the people around us have an idea that sexual immorality is not appropriate. But Paul's got to say it. He's got to put it into words for those people for whom they don't have that. Now, who might not have that?
Wasn't that a part of their religious worship anyway? I mean,
If you were a part of the temple of Aphrodite, that was part of the religious worship. That was part of how you just got along good together, right? So it is possible that there are religions or peoples through time who would not understand that sexual immorality is not appropriate. Okay? So Paul calls it out. Things like that don't work out good for being in God's family. Go ahead. He says, or any kind of impurity or greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. No, does he say, or else you won't be saved? Or you're going to go straight to hell. You're going to be condemned to hell. Oh boy. That's not what he's talking about here. Because he believes we're saved by grace. He's been talking about us being saved by grace. But now that you're saved by grace, live like dearly loved children. Learn to control your behavior. Learn to have these behaviors. So he's calling out the things that don't work. Verse 4, nor should there be obscenity. Did you read that? Now there's one for our world. We've gotten very accustomed to hearing obscenity. Even now on television, you hear things that are quite incredible. It used to be you didn't hear it on TV. But now you hear it there. And if you go to movies, David and I can't even go to an R movie anymore. And some PG-13s we cringe at. So obscenity. Now he's calling it out. Now we say, Oh, of course, everyone knows that sexual immorality is not appropriate. Then it comes to obscenity, and people say, oh, well, he doesn't mean this word or that word. Because that's the thing in our culture right now. It's easy to try to find some excuse for it. But Paul is calling it out. He doesn't know what we favor and don't favor as a sin. We think of obscenity as a little sin and sexual immorality as a big sin. And Paul is calling it out. He's calling it all out. What else does he call out? Foolish talk or coarse joking. We've all had that going around, huh? And that's difficult to clean up the way we're talking, to clean up the kinds of jokes we're making. Why do we play with things that are evil or sinful? Why do we make it a joke? What happens when we make it a joke? Then it's not all of a sudden not quite so serious. We should not be having coarse joking or foolish talk like that. Next one, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a man as an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be partners with them. You know, what Paul is saying here is not that you're going to be cast out of salvation because you sin. What he's saying is that when you sin, you link yourself with people who are without God. When the wrath comes on those people that are without God, guess who else is going to be dealing with that wrath? We also will have those consequences to our nation, to everything, to our lives, our families, because of our association with that. We should have nothing to do with those practices. So we should stay away from those people and never talk to somebody who says curse words that we don't like. Is that what he's saying? No. He's saying we do have relationship. Therein lies the rub. How do you stay in relationship, some sort of relationship, where you can reach people who can be so different in their moral point of view than you?
Love.
Love. How does love get through things like, let's say, alcoholism? Let's say that you struggle with the use of alcohol. How do you be around people who are drinking if you struggle with alcohol?
Remember where you came from.
Remember who you are.
Yeah.
Remember where you came from. Remember who you are. It is hard. It may not be hard for you now, but I know it's hard because for me it's not alcohol. Right? It's for me it's ice cream or food, calories. So we all have our thing. It could be gossip. It could be being greedy. Like we like to get around and talk with someone who's got all this, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make this money, and you're all into like money, like getting really greedy and making that the value. We all fall prey to some of that kind of thinking. And Paul is saying, get your mind straight. Don't put yourself in with those behaviors that are immoral, improper behaviors. Love the people. Love people. But you're going to have to watch for these behaviors. Don't align yourself with them. Go ahead, Vern. Do you want to say something?
No.
Okay. Verse 8. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for it is light that makes everything visible. This is why it is said, wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Do you hear what that's saying? Is it saying I should reveal that Charlene is a dirty, rotten ice cream eater?
Yeah.
Now I'm going to tell the truth.
That is the truth. Pick something else.
Pick something else. Well, the point is that this doesn't say go call out anybody who's doing wrong. It says call out what is wrong. Call out what is sin. It says the thing. Look, it says have nothing to do with fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It's not saying like when the guys brought the lady who was caught in adultery to Jesus. Well, where was the man? He was probably in the crowd bringing her to report to Jesus, right? When we call out a person, trying to expose a person or identify a person, that's not what this is talking about. This would have instead have been a man saying, we need to talk about this adultery that's going on. Let's talk about this because this is happening right here in our synagogue. And we're supposed to be good Jewish people following after God's way, and adultery is not the way. Right? That would have been calling out, exposing the deed, talking about the things that so easily entangle us so that we can help get untangled. It's not about calling out every individual who has whatever problem. Oh, Mike, we're just going to talk about you again. You know, we're going to talk about the terrible things that Mike thinks in his head or whatever it is, right? Instead, we need to be calling out the thing, the deeds. And then those are the things we aspire to do better. And why? Look at why. Let's see. And find out what pleases the Lord. Verse 10. And find out what pleases the Lord. So we're doing it because we want to please God. Because he's loved us and forgiven us. And because of that grace that he's applied to us, we want to be pleasing to him. And so we choose to do these different things, to learn, to grow, to be pleasing to God. It's a part of our maturing. Take a look at verse 15. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing and make music in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, herein we get to our interlinear Greek. So he keeps saying, do what's pleasing to God. Then he talks about the things that are pleasing to God. Don't be involved in things that take you away from God. And he talks about what those things are. These are category heads on each piece. For some reason, in my New International Version, at Ephesians 5, verse 21, on mine, look at yours, mine has the subheading above 22. Does yours, or does it have it above 21?
Above 22.
Yeah, that's odd, isn't it? Because, let me show you why that's odd. Well, it's not actually about marriage. It's about what's in 21. Look at verse 21. So this interlinear New International Version has the subheading above 21.
Mine has it above 21.
And others, like this New International Version that I have on my thing, has it above 22. I think it's interesting that it's above 21 on this Greek version, because it's not about the wives to the husbands, it's about what's in verse 21, which is what?
Everyone.
Submitting to one another. First, he talks about wives. Then if you look down, look at your subheadings. Verse 25, he talks about the husbands. Then in verse 6, he talks about children. Chapter 6, he starts children. 6 verse 5, he talks about slaves and masters. This whole section goes together. From 5:21 all the way through 6:9, that all goes together. Look at chapter 6, verse 10. What's the first word?
Finally.
Finally. So it's saying, okay, now that we've got that taken care of, let's take a look at the last piece. Let's just putting on the armor of God. This section is the last part of the section on doing the right thing and describing what that means, what that looks like, so that people who have not had exposure to the Jewish faith, Jews would be going, oh, brother, here we go. Right, we know that, right? They know, but these other religions don't know. And so Paul's having to call it out. And he gets to this whole section, and now he's going to deal with the relationships that we have with one another. And what should that look like in a Christian family, or as Christians relate with one another? What should that look like? And he calls it out here. So in my interlinear Greek, let me read to you what it says the translation of verse 21 is. I'm going to read it exactly as in the order that the Greek words are in. It's you look at yours. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Let me read you verse 21. Being subject to one another in the fear of Christ. Pretty similar, wouldn't you say? That's like almost the same thing. Okay, now you look at your verse 22, and I'm going to read, and when you see a problem, you tell me when something's different. Verse 22. The wives, let me see here. The wives to their own husbands as to the Lord. Uh-oh.
Mine says submit.
What about submit?
Yeah, submit.
I heard it when we were at the wedding.
How come the guys mentioned that word?
Right there.
It's a
Yeah,
guy
so
thing.
Vern, if I show Vern here, verse 22 in the Greek, the wives to their own husbands as to the Lord.
Well, they left some words out there.
Mm.
Hey, don't tell Levon.
Don't tell him on.
But then you
Goes the other
go,
way. We added some words.
Yes.
CSB version,
Right?
Okay, CSB, listen to it.
the CSB version, verse 20 and 21 is one sentence. And it's a period, and then after it says, in the fear of Christ, period.
20 and 21 or 21 and 22?
No, 20 and 21 are one sentence. Giving thanks always for everything to God, to the Father, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, comma, submitting to one another in the fear of Christ.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, that's a good, the Greek doesn't have any, there's no punctuation in Greek.
but
So- Go ahead.
but in your class there, it says here, you don't have to put submit in 22 because you already got submit in 21.
Exactly. Exactly. They didn't have to put the word submit in 22 because it's referring to what's above. But Jerry, you're right. It could be also that the issue of the submission is linked to that last verse in 21, because if you look at 20, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That would make sense, right? But the reason verse 22 in the Greek doesn't have the word submit is because it's referring to the word submit before. Now, we also have this little problem because our word submit has a pejorative sense. And the word submit in Greek doesn't necessarily have that pejorative. Pejorative is like a command, like submit, like something you're going to command someone to do. So in Greek, though, it's more of a relationship. It's a position, sort of. So I don't know if that makes any difference to you, but
Well, the way, where you read it there, it didn't say submit, though. It used a different phrase.
in verse 20 in the Greek, in verse 21 in the Greek, it says being subject.
Being subject.
Now, that's my
Being
point.
In a position of service.
Right.
But not necessarily for
Not
service, but willing
commanded
service.
to you.
Either one.
Serving.
Yeah, either way. It could be, the Greek word could be used, you could translate it as submit. The problem is that for us in English, we only have one kind of way of thinking of submit. It's in a pejorative sense. But you could say that they do it in language, or some participle is submits to the other, is controlled by the other. There's some
all
kind of
relative.
grammar, yeah. It's your relationship, it's position. One is dependent on or attached to or functioning with the other. So the actual Greek word that we translate as submit, here it's being translated as subject to one another. Subject. I don't know. Well, that's above in verse 21, where it says submit to one another. It's using the term subject. So a word that some scholars say may communicate it more clearly in English is defer. What do you think? Defer. Maybe not?
Defer kind of gives the attitude of, well, I don't want to have to take responsibility for that. So
True.
You decide.
You put it on to someone else.
Yeah.
Sounds like partnership.
Yeah. Well, good luck finding a good word. I think submit is probably the best English word for us to use. I think it's probably a good word for us to use, probably as close as you can get, except we have to remember that it has a little bit of a broader meaning there. Not to say that that it has that meaning also. Let's take a look at what it says, though. I am, though, on verse 22, I'm going to take out the word submit because that is not in the Greek. In verse 22, that word is not there at all. It's referring back to the previous. Go ahead.
In my American Standard, it says that wives be subject, but that is in italics, meaning it wasn't in the original. I think they're trying to remind you of the word subject back in.
Exactly, be subject to. And so to me, it's not a big difference, but it is a critical difference because what it leads to me is the organization. In other words, in my mind, I can use the word submit. That's fine for me. I feel like it communicates close enough. But to me, the issue is the organization. So if we start like Jerry was saying, always giving thanks to God for everything in the name of Lord Jesus Christ. What are we doing there? Is that not submitting? Giving thanks to the Lord Jesus Christ because he's everything to us. He's the founder of the feast, you want to call it. He's the one we're referring to, deferring to, subject to, submitting to. So what does it look like when I submit to Christ out of a thankful heart? What does that look like? What's it look like if you're a wife? Let's look at what it looks like when you're a wife.
It's a loving relationship.
Wives, to your husbands as to the Lord. Now wait a minute. What is my relationship to the Lord?
You're willingly submitting yourself to him. You're deferring, like you said.
I'm
to him.
deferring. I'm submitting. I'm giving over to him. Am I fearful? Anxious? I don't need to be, do I? God is a loving Father. That's what this whole description has been about, a Father that we willingly want to defer to,
Right.
or subject to, or submit to. It's a willingness that we have. Is that a problem for women, some women? Yes. I don't know why it is. We tend to not honor our husbands the way that we should and give them some measure of respect. We tend to belittle and criticize and want to buck up against it, which is probably the very reason that God put this here for us, that Paul is saying this, because we probably could be a little better about that. I know that's not popular, but I think we could be a little better about that, ladies. And have you ever noticed that it seems like one of the basic needs of a man is to feel honored? There's something weird that happens when you honor a man. I don't know what it is, but they seem to straighten their shoulders up and they just are better. They're better at everything they do when we show them honor. Now, are they due the honor? Do they deserve it?
No.
It doesn't matter. I'm subjecting, I'm submitting, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. God has asked me to honor my husband. I'm going to do it. Or at least I'm going to try. Verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church. How is Christ head of the church? I don't see him around much. You see Christ around? How is he head of the church?
In our relationship with God.
Right. What is Christ? It says that the man, we are to honor the man in the same way that Christ, because he's the head, like Christ is head of the church. So in your relationship with your spouse, you agree to how things are going to go and what you're going to do and how things are going to happen, and then you follow through on it, right? Are you subversive? Do you go on after your own thing and do it a different way, even though you agreed that this was how you were going to do things? That would not be in subject, right? When you together have a marriage and you're in relationship with one another and you decide we're going to do this and we're going to do that, then you should follow up with it and do things that way and be willing to submit to that authority in the sense that you made this agreement together. That's what happened with Christ. Christ gave himself, sacrificed himself for us, and then what's our response? Well, thanks, God, but I'm going to do what I want, right?
That's a word.
Yeah, yeah. We as a church, submit to what Christ has provided for us. But that doesn't mean that we're like quaking in our boots and obeying every little move and whatever. That's not the relationship. So when you view what Christ's relationship is with the church, that's the relationship between between the wife to the husband. We haven't gotten to the husband yet. Okay, we're just talking about that the wife should honor or respect or demonstrate that kind of subject to the man, to the husband. Let's go. Of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Oh, we don't like that, do we? But that is the way that we, as women, that's the way that we honor the man and his role. Take a look at verse 25. Husbands, What's the next word?
Love.
Okay, now wait a minute. What was it for wives?
Submit.
It's both submit.
Obey.
They're both submit. Yes, the words obey, but they're both submit. If you go back, the whole heading is, how do you submit to this loving Christ who provided grace for us? How do we submit? How do we submit to Christ? How do we, where it says, how do we give thanks to God for everything? For the wife, it's to think of honoring her husband, showing respect or deferment. For the husband, it's to love his wife. How? Just as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church?
He laid down his life for it.
Laid down his life for the church. That doesn't mean ruling with us.
Right.
Didn't he make her submit?
Oh.
And he rubbed it in her face?
There's the problem, right?
Yeah.
The problem is we have people that don't do either one of these. You take either one out of the equation
It's
and
out
it
of
doesn't
balance.
work.
Yeah.
If you have a husband who is truly submitting himself to the wife by loving her,
He's not Lord, he's serving.
and if you have the wife doing just the other thing, honoring the husband who's serving her, do you see how that's a whole new way to look at that relationship? It's not about one person being in charge. It's not even about, please don't say to me, it's about you have to have somebody to make a final decision. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. So it's not about having a final decision maker. It's about the relationship. And the more that we can honor our husbands, ladies, the easier it is for them to do what they're supposed to do, which is love us in a sacrificial love, like Christ loved the church. So it's kind of a yin and yang. As we do one, the other is easier to do. And why does it start with the wife?
It doesn't.
It does right here. Wives were first and then the men.
Well,
Why didn't it start with the man?
It started with
Is there
everyone.
harder headed?
It started with everyone because the principle is submission, right? Or being subject to. And then the first thing it talks about wives, because in a patriarchal society, don't you think there were some women who had a few things to say? And they probably felt very oppressed and frustrated with it all.
Yeah.
Also, I don't know, you guys can disagree with me because it's not right here, but it seems to me that ladies, when we do what we're supposed to do, if we stay with it, the man responds in this way. He becomes increasingly sacrificial, increasingly willing to submit himself to us. The more that we honor and call out the good, call out what's possible and what's good. Go ahead,
I have a
Brianna.
question. So, like, are men and women equal, or is one more higher power than the other?
Okay, Christ
That's my
says
question.
that we are submissive to him.
Okay.
And then we have this relationship with one another where we give to one another. So who's the most important to God? Who's in charge from God's point of view?
Christ.
Where's Brianna fit in? I don't see your name here. Right, the Christ is. So we're serving Christ. So even though I'm older than you are and I've had a lot more school than you've had, I'm not any more valuable to Christ than you are. You are just as valuable.
Okay.
And you could look at Allison and you could say, who's more important, Brianna or Allison? Because you're older than Allison. Who's more important?
We both are.
From Christ's perspective, we're just souls in relationship with him. So there is no hierarchy like that. The only hierarchy is Christ.
So we're equal then.
You want to call it equal? What he calls it is subject to one another, because we're subject first to Christ. In other words, we yield to Christ first, Brianna. We're yielding to Christ. And because we yield to Christ, then even when I'm really mad at David, I'm supposed to try to honor him. And even though David may be really mad at me, he's supposed to sacrificially love me. Right?
After the argument.
After the argument. So this is the way that it works out. This is the way we work out our salvation, our relationship. It's hard, so hard to do. So easy to say and so hard to do. Eve?
Does this tie, I can't remember the verse, I'm sorry, I got it on my mirror, I don't remember where it comes from. but it's like to get up each day and do what you have to do as if you were doing it for the Lord and not man. So doesn't this kind of
This is exactly what it is. But people would be saying, like you, because you're kind of a specific person, if Paul says that to you, then you say, yeah, but what about in this situation? What about in this situation? So Paul's trying to give some clarity for that. So he's describing for women, that would mean that you are going to honor your husband and show them honor. And it means for husbands, you're going to sacrificially love your wives. Don't you think that the Jewish males would be having a big conversation about the sacrificially loving your wives thing in a patriarchal society? See, we argue about the part that's a little different than what our society would say. And every culture or society that's read this over time has argued with different parts. We're going to get to more parts down here. Wait till you see some of this other stuff. Let's keep going on the men. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and takes care for it, just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. That is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. He's not even talking about husbands and wives here. He says right there, what I'm really talking about is Christ and the church. That's what I'm really talking about. But nonetheless, husbands and wives, this is his final statement. He's going to sum it up in one thing. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So bottom line, he's talking about Christ and the church, using the husband and the wife as an example. And his bottom line is that wives, you should respect your husbands, and husbands, you should love your wife as you love yourself. Take a look at Galatians 3:28. Keep your finger on Ephesians, though, Brianna, because we're just going to look at one verse in Galatians 3:28.
It's just a couple pages to the left.
3:28. Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, nor Muslim, nor Jehovah's Witness, nor Mormon, nor, right? Put all your own nors there. There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, low-life mechanic to business supervisor, shark millionaire to the person begging on the street, slave nor free, poor or rich, doesn't matter. Next one, male nor female. What? We just read about all this male and female stuff over here. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. This is Paul writing to the Galatians. So remember, Paul sees male nor female. He's not making one. He's not trying to describe that one is in charge of the other. He's describing how our relationship should be to Christ as a church. And he's using the husband and wife relationship to describe that. In the end, the final word is, each of you also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. That's the bottom line. And it's so funny to me, verses 25 to 31 is all about the husband to the wife. The verses on the wife are 2 verses. So we've got 7 verses on the husband, 2 on the wife.
In that other one.
Yes, there is. There is a lot of work in it.
Good question.
Yes.
I was just reading the couple verses before in Galatians 3:28 and 27. You are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. A it seems to me that given that context, this is talking about believers.
Yes.
And I don't think a Muslim would consider to be baptized.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. Yes. I was thinking Jew nor Greek in terms of where you come from.
Right, okay.
Like
Middle
before you
Eastern
come
Jews.
into Christ, before you accept Christ, you could be anything.
Mhm.
And we then are, I could see where that could be misconstrued though. Because people would say, well, it wouldn't matter what you believe. But I think what I was thinking of, it wouldn't matter, it doesn't matter what you used to believe. It doesn't matter what you used to be. And some people in Christianity, we aren't as open as we should be to people changing and becoming Christians. And when you become a Christian, sometimes you have some of the baggage from whatever you came from, you know, and it takes a little while to learn. And we seem to forgive the baggage that's Anglo-Saxon and not forgive the baggage that comes from other cultures or entities as much. But you're right, that's a good point to make. It's not saying that anybody is in Christ. It's saying that once you're in Christ, it doesn't matter what you came from. And I'm not going to be able to change being male or female. Well, I guess nowadays you could, huh? You wouldn't be able to change being slave or free in that time, you know? So,
I mean, you could, but that's actually
right. Yeah, that's right. So let's go on here to chapter 6. What does it talk about in 6?
Children.
Children. So we have male and female, but it's all talking about Christ and the church. Now he's going to go on and get practical with children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Now, what's there next? Verse 4. Fathers. I didn't circle that one. I need to put that one in. What did you say, Aaron?
Father told me if I want to enjoy a long life, I better behave.
Fathers, do not, let's see, back up to children, obey your parents. Let's make sure that's clear. Obey your parents, children. No matter what they tell you to do, you should obey them. Right, Brianna? Look what it says there.
They tell you to jump off a cliff, are you gonna do it?
There's some boundaries in there, aren't there, Brianna? Yeah, it's talking about this general principle, right? That you should be obedient to your parents, and that when you do, things will go well with you because they've lived before you, and it's you want to have a long life, you want to do well in this world, your parents tend to know how to guide you. Are there limits to that?
Yes.
Absolutely, they're just humans, like all of us. Verse 4, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. How would a father exasperate a child?
By pointing out everything they do wrong.
Being picky,
Yeah.
right? Being overbearing, maybe? Uh-huh.
And sometimes
Too many
it's
rules.
expecting too much.
Too many rules, expecting too much, more than what a child is able to actually do at the time. Children do grow and develop, and they don't understand things as, you know, when they understand things in a kind of an odd way as they're getting older. And you notice it when they're real little. I forget, there's been so many examples this weekend because Annabelle and Alan are talking more and more, and every once in a while you'll say something and you'll hear them and you think that's what they're saying, and then all of a sudden you go, oh wait, you're saying this, you know. He was telling me something about his Band-Aid, and I thought he said he had to go poop, I think it was. I'm going, well, you know, that's a very different response, you know, on my part. So I think as kids grow, they change and develop, and it would be easy to exasperate your child, to make them feel like there's no win, no way to be successful or to be pleasing. That would be exasperating.
That's the typical, or my personal feeling on it is that you have this expectation and sometimes things don't go according to plan. And you sit here and look at this person and you wonder, you know, why aren't they like I think they should be as far as your children go? And then you have to accept, or I do have to accept, that the Lord is going to use the gifts that He's going to give to her and is going to be a blessing to others. He's going to use that to be of service to others. And it's not about what I think.
Right.
It's about God's plan.
Right.
And I don't know His plan. and he has a reason that things are the way they are, I have to accept that. I have to embrace it and figure out how I can be there to help that gift flourish.
Yes.
And to me, that's the biggest, because in my mind, I want things to be a certain way, and they're not that way. And it's sobering.
Yes, it is. It is. Being a parent is a humbling thing, I think. You really realize, don't you think, Julia?
Yeah.
It's like you really,
And it's funny to see how even though you and your spouse might be working as a team and parenting, this thing that bothers you might not bother them, and vice versa. And you might just be like, oh, whatever, it just slides off my back. But then the spouse gets home and it irritates them, and you think, well, you know, it is. It's a hard job.
yeah. So on the next part, verse 5, slaves and masters. Now, we don't think of this the same way, because we don't really have a society that we currently live in where slavery is normal or typical. And there was, at this time, it was a normal part of society. There were people as slaves. It was one of the ways you took care of debt. If today you go into bankruptcy. Then you didn't go into bankruptcy, you had to go into slavery. You might be a slave for 5 years, 10 years, or the rest of your life, depending on what your debt was. Also, we have the stories where people were captured and sold into slavery. So this was all common. Slavery was common. Verse 5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart. What? Just as you would obey Christ.
Whatever your position in life.
Yeah, I would think in that day the slave would like spit in the cup or something. Like feel revengeful or feel negative. I would see it as a very like a negative position in society or culture. It seems like it would be even a lower than being a servant, where a servant maybe is getting some pay or some recompense for doing it. But it seems like a slave is like, it seems like that would be so low, and I could see that being a problem, to say your attitude needs to be as if you were, as you would obey Christ. 6, obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free. So what do you think in your life? Do you sometimes feel that you're the slave? Maybe it's to your employer. Maybe it's just someone who's very bossy and demeaning. Maybe you're working at Jack in a Box and they're just being real, harsh with you or whatever, right? We all feel like that sometimes, put upon by whoever's our supervisor, whoever we're supposed to be working for. So what Paul is saying is, here's the Christian attitude. Do you work heartily as to the Lord? Because the Lord is the one who gives a reward. That verse 7, Brianna, that would be a good one. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free. So we do our work to the Lord out of graciousness to God, even when we feel like we're being bossed around or put upon or having to do something we don't want to do. We do it as if we were doing it to the Lord. I don't know. What do you think, Joan?
I think it makes a big difference of your attitude, because you can see that even if somebody's mean to you or they do things that are not that hurt you deeply, but if you approach them with a godly attitude, if you approach them with grace and with humility, and that it makes a difference. They change their demeanor and how they behave towards you, because they see there's something different in you than what they have. And so it happens
Instead of
time and
assuming
time
the
again.
insult, right? Instead of assuming the insult,
Right.
assuming the wrong,
Right.
you're assuming always the positive behavior, that it's, because your reward is from God, you're doing the right thing. Instead of doing the wrong thing in reply to their wrong thing, tit for tat. They were mean to you, so you're going to be mean back. They didn't treat you right, so you're not going to do this right. That doesn't go anywhere. But this does go somewhere, because no matter what happens on this world, in this life, you still have Christ who will make it all right for you. Yeah.
And sometimes it makes it all right for them, because then they'll see what you have and they'll want it too.
God is so funny the way he figures that out, huh? Like, Yeah.
But you can change other people's lives. I mean, with that action that you have and teaching, well, I mean, by your
Yes.
showing them what they could be through Christ, then that changes their lives. So you don't
Yes.
actually do it, but God lets you do it.
Yes.
He uses you
Yes.
to do it.
Yes. He can use us. Verse 9. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there are no favoritism with him. So if you're the one who's in charge, then you have a responsibility to do the same thing. Do your work heartily as to the Lord, and don't threaten, because you know that God is the one who will make the final right and wrong. Okay? So next week we'll start at chapter 6, verse 10. Ephesians 6:10 is where we'll start. Okay, so is that the same or different from what you thought about submission? Same or different?
I think it's a little bit different, thinking of it as being an example, not the point of what he's saying. Like,
Oh, good.
'cause
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like this gets taken as like the creed of a wife and a husband instead of thinking, how can we serve Christ?
Because he says several times, this is about Christ and the church, right? But also, nevertheless, this is true. So you're right. Thinking about it in that term is helpful to me too.
It's interesting to think of that as, because sometimes in our relationship with Christ, we might not understand why God wants us to do something a certain way. Just like in our relationship with our spouse, sometimes they want this, they tell us to do it this way or that way, and we don't understand that all the time. But still being willing to work with that person and love that person and submit to that person, it kind of changes. It changed the way I thought about the scripture for sure.
I think of that passage where Jesus has the disciple go catch the fish to get the taxes. Do you remember that story where the taxes were due? The taxes are due, and so Jesus says, go catch a fish and get our taxes, for it was his tax and Jesus' tax to pay his tax. And he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Why did Jesus do that? He knew he was going to the cross. He's not going to be around long enough for them to come and get him, because he didn't. Yeah, exempt. He's not going to be around long enough for. Why did he do that?
Setting an example.
He was complying. That was the law of the land. He was supposed to pay a tax, and so were his followers. He complied with the law of the land. Now, on the other hand, he got killed on a cross. I would say Jesus was not being very submissive then by getting killed on the cross.
You're being facetious.
He made the Roman soldiers mad. Why did he make them mad? He was willing to pay the tax, but he wasn't willing to say that he was not God. Right? Jesus wasn't obedient and subservient and submissive to everyone all the time.
That's not the way.
He was submissive to God and God's plan, and that happened to contradict the men's plan around him. And so he had to conflict with those men. But whenever possible, he caught a fish and paid his taxes. In my attempt to honor my husband, where there will be times when I will have to not honor my husband, not be subject to him, potentially. Potentially. Will there be times when a man is going to have to not love his wife in the way that was described here? Potentially. There are boundaries and limitations. This is the way we're supposed to live our lives, right? So he doesn't say this is the rule, rule 1, rule 2, rule 3, blah, blah. It's not like that anymore. He's asking us to mature and learn and grow and figure this out. And as we do, we're drawing closer and closer to the right relationship between Christ and the church and the relationship between one another. But the truth is that Jesus was a little bit disobedient to those Romans in that he got killed on the cross for not admitting that he was not the Messiah. He was supposed to, if he had said that, if he says, oh, I'm just a good teacher, I don't know why everybody's all, the Romans would have had no problem. But he didn't do that. And yet he paid the taxes out of the fish. He didn't even try. He didn't even make a case for it. He hardly spoke at all during the time when he's being taken to the cross. He hardly said anything at all. He could have made a case, defended himself. Paul did. Why didn't he defend himself? Why didn't he make a case? He will let the guy go down and catch a fish to pay his taxes, but he won't make a case for his own life. See, that's exactly right. So we have to, when we're looking at being subject to one another, honoring one another, loving one another, this is a way of life, an attitude that whether we're free or slave, we're doing our work heartily as to the Lord. When we love someone, we're loving them like Christ loved the church, being willing to sacrifice our very selves to see them do well and prosper and do what they need to do. And when we honor someone, we honor them like we would Christ. We honor them as Christ is in them, as if Christ were in them. That's what we're doing. Our honor is going to Christ. Our submission, our love, our subject is because we're subjecting to Christ. That's who we're really subjecting to. It's about Christ in the church and the Christ that's in them. And we have people who are in a marriage where they became a Christian and maybe their spouse is not a Christian. There's all kinds of things that could be put in that relationship, right? That would be very difficult to go by. Shoot, I think it's hard when you're both Christians. I think it's hard when you're both Christians. But I am 58. I don't know about you all, but I feel like I've learned a few things. And one thing I have learned is for some reason, when in a husband and wife relationship, when the woman finds ways to honor her husband, and when the man finds ways to love his wife, something just absolutely works. And you can puzzle over why all day long, but it's just a weird kind of thing. And what is honoring to my David is not the same thing that might be honoring to Jerry or honoring to Vern or honoring to Aaron, right? That's kind of a broad term, what they would consider honoring. Well, if all the truth that is that that's true about love too. What would be considered loving to me might be different to Joan, might be different to Heather, might be different to Julia. What we interpret as loving, right? So the principle is the principle. The principle is I need to find ways to honor my husband. What are the things that he considers being honoring, and I should try to do that. And if you're a man, you should look for ways to be loving to your wife and show her your love and be willing to sacrifice yourself in love toward her. It's like magic. Try it. It's pretty cool.
In my experience, the first thing that you have to do in any situation is submit yourself to the Lord. Once you do that, then He will handle, for me, my personal experience.
Don't you feel like it's kind of like the one has to be first? You submit yourself to the Lord, and then you do that because you're submitting yourself to the Lord.
But I've learned it does not matter.
Doesn't matter?
If it doesn't change her,
right?
It's changed me.
Right, exactly.
And the end goal is not to change her.
Exactly.
The end goal is to change myself and for me to be more like Christ.
Exactly.
And whatever happens after that, happens after that.
Yes.
It's God. I've submitted to His will. His will is done.
Right. Exactly.
Can I add something?
Please.
Sometimes if I feel like Allison, my wife, is not respecting me, then I take a step back and ask myself, am I loving her? And then if I realize, I'm not, and I make a determination to do something to show her that I love her. For her primary love language is words of affirmation. So, I might write a card or a poem or just tell her something, a text message, and I keep that up, I will get the respect. So
it's a weird magic that happens.
Yeah, it is. You don't ask for the respect without first offering your service of love.
You can't demand it. You have to give it.
And you can't do it in expectation that it's absolutely going to happen. Like, well, I'll honor him, but he'd better show me love for it. Because like you said, I'm not really honoring him.
Yeah.
I'm actually honoring Christ. I'm submitting myself to Christ. And this is the way my life is going to look when I submit myself to Christ. So I'm going to make that appearance because I'm going to do that. I'm going to make that action because that's what Christ has asked me to do. Like you said, we're submitting ourselves actually to Christ in all these relationships, even slave-free to your employer, to all of those relationships. Anyone else have anything to add? Well, thank you. Okay, we'll start in